He will be a human man, fully empowered, if you will, by Satan.
Wait, so the big Antichrist is not Satan?
No. He is a human person, a human male, who will be empowered by Satan. Yes?
You referenced 677 in the catechism. Is that what you're going to talk about today?
Yes.
Would we eventually talk about 682, which is regarding the judge of the living and the dead?
The judgment of the living and the dead? That is coming. I'm establishing the whole idea of what does Revelation chapter 20 verses 1 through 4 mean. And what I'm establishing is what it doesn't mean right now. This is what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that there is this 1,000-year period known as the millennium that occurs after the second coming of Christ on earth. That's a typical evangelical Protestant theological idea. The church clearly states that that kind of idea is to be rejected. Millenarianism, as it's called. Because the belief in this 1,000-year period is not totally agreed upon by all Protestant churches. Much like the rapture idea, there are 3 dominant views. Okay? The 3 dominant views are what is known as pre-millennianism, can't spell today, millennianism. This is the dominant view that you will hear on the radio and television by preachers. Premillennialism is basically the belief in this literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. Okay? Why is it premillennial? Because it happens before the end of time, before the final judgment, and before the eternity future. Okay? It happens before that. It's something that happens after that. Okay? There is a less dominant, less popular view called post-millennialism. Okay? Post-millennialism is closer to what Catholics believe. I would say it's closer. They still believe in a 1,000-year period, but that it happens at the end of time, after the great judgment of God. Okay? It's less common, but that there's still this literalism of a 1,000-year period. The one that is not embraced by modern evangelical Protestants is something called amillennialism. Oops, too many M's. This is the belief that there is no millennium, that it's somehow a spiritual thing, and that there is no literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. All of this has to do is, does Jesus physically reign on earth for 1,000 years or not? That's what it's asking. And it's all trying to answer these first 4 verses of Revelation 20. What does this mean? Satan is bound for 1,000 years. the church, the saints that come with him, reign with him for 1,000 years. What does that mean? Some believe it's a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth that will happen after the tribulation period. That's this. Okay? That's the dominant view that most evangelical Protestant Christians hold today. It's what I believed. Okay? Why? The one thing I was told, and I was never given specifics as I remember in my theology classes, it was just an assumption, but it was never really explained, other than this. Why 1,000 years? It was explained to me by my professors at the time that the reason that Christ has to reign for 1,000 years is to finally fulfill some of the Old Testament prophecies of a literal Davidic kingdom on earth. And so since that never happened in Jesus' first coming, he has to do it in his second. And so you finally get to reign as the Davidic king at this period of time, and finally fulfill all of the prophecies of the Old Testament about his coming. That's why it needs to happen. And I thought, oh, okay. But I was never told where or how come. Because isn't Jesus reigning now, spiritually? Why does he need to reign physically? What's the point? And that was never really clearly explained. All right, and I actually went and I talked to a more recent Protestant pastor about this. And I said, can you recommend a good book to finally explain why is there a need for a millennium? And he gave me a reference, and I looked it up, and even in that book, I was given very vague, in my opinion, very vague reasons as to why, other than it's because Jesus didn't reign on earth during his first coming. So he needs to reign as a king. Why 1,000 years? It's because that's what it says. It's just very literal. Okay? So that's the predominant view. Postmillennialism is really not even given much credibility in evangelical Protestantism because A, I think it's too close to Catholicism. Because basically what you say is that when Jesus comes back, he establishes his kingdom and then it just goes on forever. That's the Catholic view. When Jesus comes back, that's it. Period. End of story. We go into what is called eternity future, and there's a new heaven, new earth. End of story. We live happily ever after. And we'll find out what happens then when we get there. That's really what the Catholic view is. There's none of this. I'm just telling you this because this is mentioned in our catechism as something that we do not hold to be true. Does that make sense? And this is the predominant view that you hear on Christian television, Christian radio, anyone that's a Bible prophecy preacher. This is just assumed. Okay? Seth.
Yeah, I was curious to know, maybe from David to Solomon through, I think you said Jebekiah was the last king. I'm wondering, was that 1,000 years?
No.
The total reign?
No. From the time David ruled until the deportation was a little more than 500 years.
Okay. I'm wondering if maybe that was the 1,000 I got.
I notice our time is escaping. We've just, as God said to Adam and Eve, you've only just begun. We've only just begun to scratch this deep philosophical, theological concept of the first 4 verses of chapter 20. And I've established in this what we do not believe. Hopefully, I will have some time next week to go into what we do believe. about these verses? How then do we understand them? And I'm going to brace yourself, because I have to say I disagree somewhat with what Scott Hahn says about this. I take it back. I believe everything he said.
There you go.
It's kind of creepy.
That wasn't it?
Yes.
That is creepy.
I told you to brace yourself. The reason why I say that is because Scott Hahn has quite an elaborate understanding of what these verses actually mean. And I think, in all fairness, I think there may be some truth to it, but I think that it's, I don't think it's as complex as he's making it out to be. I think there's a much simpler explanation for it. So that's all I'm saying. So I take it all back, Scott.
His ghost is here.
Yes. And I will hopefully have time next week to go into what that is. So I'm going to come back and say,
Sean White wore on the gold. She's Sean
The
White
category.
won the third gold in Olympic.
yes.
Kunin yan, binigay niya sa akin. Kunin yan.
Well, and that's because it's written in a theological language that you have to be instructed. You have to understand the vocabulary in order to understand what they're talking about. Like, what's millenarianism?
Thank you.
It's this belief
Bye,
of
Tess.
1,000 years. The church bishop, yes, right after the Second Vatican Council.
The 3 tables up.
It was part of, yes, it was the greatest gift that John Paul II gave the church since
How did that happen?